Hello, and welcome to our continuing saga of A Wrinkle in Time. As you can see, I'm wearing my best hair for today's read aloud. So the focus for today is open-ended. You can reflect in any way that you feel is appropriate for today's reading. You can write about what you thought of today's reading, maybe something that surprised you. You can make a prediction or an inference, anything that you'd like to do. So this chapter is called Absolute Zero. The first sign of returning consciousness was cold, then sound. She was aware of voices that seemed to be traveling through her across an Arctic waste. Slowly, the icy sounds cleared, and she realized that the voices belonged to her father and Calvin. She did not hear Charles Wallace. She tried to open her eyes, but the lids would not move. She tried to sit up, but she could not stir. She struggled to turn over, to move her hands, her feet, but nothing happened. She knew she had a body, but it was as lifeless as marble. She heard Calvin's frozen voice. Her heart is beating so slowly. Her father's words, but it's beating. She's alive. Barely. We couldn't find a heartbeat at all at first. We thought she was dead. Yes. And then we could feel her heart very faintly. The beats were very far apart. Then it got stronger, so all we have to do is wait. Her father's words sounded brittle in her ears, as though they were being chipped out of ice. Calvin. Yes, you're right, sir. She wanted to call out to them, I'm alive, I'm very much alive, only I've been turned to stone. But she could not call out any more than she could move. Calvin's voice again. Anyhow, you got her away from it. You got us both away and we couldn't have gone on holding out. It's so much more powerful and strong than... How did we get out, sir? How did we manage as long as we did? Her father. Because it's completely unused to being refused. That's the only reason that I could keep from being absorbed too. No mind has tried to hold out against it for so many thousands of centuries that certain centers have become soft and atrophied through lack of use. If you hadn't come to me when you did, I'm not sure how much longer I would have lasted. I was on the point of giving in. Calvin. Oh no, sir. Her father. Yes. Nothing seemed important anymore but rest. And of course, it offered me complete rest. I had almost come to the conclusion that I was wrong to fight, that it was right after all, and everything I believed in most passionately was nothing but a madman's dream. But then, you and Meg came into me, broke through my prison, and hope and faith returned. Calvin. Sir, why were you on Camazotz at all? Was there a particular reason for going there? Her father, with a frigid laugh. Going to Camazotz was a complete accident. Excuse me. I never intended even to leave our own solar system. I was heading for Mars. Tessering is even more complicated than we had expected. Calvin. Sir, how was it able to get to Charles Wallace before it got Meg and me? Her father. From what you told me, it's because Charles Wallace thought that he could deliberately go into it and return. He trusted too much in his own strength. Listen, I think her heartbeat's getting stronger. His words no longer sounded to her quite as frozen. Was it his words that were ice or her ears? Why did she hear only her father and Calvin? Why didn't she hear Charles Wallace speak? Silence. A long silence. Then Calvin's voice again. Can't we do anything? Can't we look for help? Do we have to just go on waiting? Her father. We can't leave her. And we must stay together. We must not be afraid to take time. Calvin. You mean we were? We rushed into things on Camazotz too fast. And Charles Wallace, he rushed in too fast and that's why he got caught? Maybe. I'm not sure. I don't know enough yet. Time is different on Camazotz anyhow. Our time, inadequate though it is, at least it's straightforward. It may not even be fully one-dimensional because it can't move back and forth on its line, only ahead, but at least it's consistent in its direction. Time on Camazotz seems to be inverted, turned in on itself, so I have no idea whether I was imprisoned in that column for centuries or only a few minutes. Silence for a moment. Then her father's voice again. I think I feel a pulse in her wrist now. Meg could not feel his fingers against her wrist. She could not feel her wrist at all. Her body was still stone, but her mind was beginning to be capable of movement. She tried desperately to make some kind of sound, a signal to them, but nothing happened. Their voices started again. Calvin. About your project, sir? Were you on it alone? Her father. Oh no. There were half a dozen of us working on it, and I dare say a number of others we don't even know about. Certainly, we weren't the only nation to investigate along that line. You know, it's really not a new idea, but we did try very hard not to let it be known abroad that we were going to make it practicable. Did you come to Camazotz alone? Or were there others with you? I came alone. You see, Calvin, there was no way to try it out ahead with rats or monkeys or dogs, and we had no idea whether it would really work or whether it would be a complete bodily disintegration. Playing with time and space, that's a dangerous game. But why you, sir? Oh, I wasn't the first. We do straws. I was second. What happened to the first man? We don't. Look! Did you see her eyelids move? Silence. Then, no, it was only a shadow. But I did blink, Meg tried to tell them. I'm sure I did, and I can hear you. Do something! But there was only another long silence, during which perhaps they were looking at her, watching for another shadow, another flicker. Then she heard her father's voice again, quiet, a little warmer, more like his own voice. We drew straws, and I was second. We know Hank went. We saw him go. We saw him vanish right in front of the rest of us. He was there, and then he wasn't. We were to wait for a year for his return for some message, and we waited. Nothing. Calvin, his voice cracking. Jeepers, sir. You must have been in sort of a flap. Her father. Yes. It's a frightening as well as an exciting thing to discover that matter and energy are the same thing, that size is an illusion, and that time is just a material substance. We can know this, but it's far more than we can understand with our puny little brains. I think you'll be able to comprehend far more than I, and Charles Wallace even more than you. Yes, but what happened, please, sir, after the first man? Meg could hear her father sigh. Then it was my turn. I went, and here I am, a wiser and a humbler man. I'm sure I haven't been gone 2 years. Now that you've come, I have some hope that I may be able to return in time. One thing I have to tell the others is that we know nothing. Calvin. What do you mean, sir? Her father. Just what I say. We're children, playing with dynamite. In our mad rush, we've plunged into this before. With a desperate effort, Meg made a sound. It wasn't a very loud sound, but it was a sound. And Mr. Murray stopped. Hush, listen. Meg made a strange croaking noise. She found that she could pull open her eyelids. They felt heavier than marble, but she managed to raise them. Her father and Calvin were hovering over her. She did not see Charles Wallace. Where was he? She was lying in an open field of what looked like rusty, stubby grass. She blinked slowly and with difficulty. Meg, her father said, Meg, are you all right? Her tongue felt like a stone tongue in her mouth, but she managed to croak. I can't move. Try, Calvin urged. He sounded now as though he were very angry with her. Wiggle your toes, wiggle your fingers. I can't. Where's Charles Wallace? Her words were blunted by the stone tongue. Perhaps they could not understand her, for there was no answer. We were knocked out for a minute too, Calvin was saying. You'll be all right, Meg. Don't get panicky. He was crouched over her, and though his voice continued to sound cross, he was peering at her with anxious eyes. She knew that she must still have her glasses on because she could see him clearly. His freckles, his stubby black lashes, the bright blue of his eyes. Her father was kneeling on her other side. The round lenses of Mrs. Hu's glasses still blurred his eyes. He took one of her hands, rubbed it between his. Can you feel my fingers? He sounded quite calm, as though there was nothing extraordinary in having her completely paralyzed. At the quiet of his voice, she felt calmer. Then she saw that there were great drops of sweat standing out on his forehead, and she noticed vaguely that the gentle breeze that touched her cheeks was cool. At first his words had been frozen, now the wind was mild. Was it icy cold here or warm? Can you feel my fingers? He asked again. Yes. Now she could feel a pressure against her wrist, but she could not nod. Where's Charles Wallace? Her words were a little less blurred. Her tongue, her lips were beginning to feel cold and numb, as though she'd been given a massive dose of Novocaine at the dentist's. She realized with a start that her body and limbs were cold, that not only was she not warm, she was frozen from head to toe, and it was this that had made her father's words seem like ice that had paralyzed her. Excuse me. I'm frozen, she said faintly. Camazotz hadn't been this cold, a cold that cut deeper than the wind on the bitterest of winter days at home. She was away from it, but this unexplained iciness was almost as bad. Her father had not saved her. Now she was able to look around a little, and everything she could see was rusty and gray. There were trees edging the field in which she lay, and their leaves were the same brown as the grass. There were plants that might have been flowers, except that they were dull and gray. In contrast to the drabness of color, to the cold that numbed her, the air was filled with a delicate spring-like fragrance, almost imperceptible, as it blew softly against her face. She looked at her father and Calvin. They were both in their shirt sleeves, and they looked perfectly comfortable. It was she, wrapped in their clothes, who was frozen too solid even to shiver. "Why am I so cold?" she asked. "Where's Charles Wallace?" He didn't answer. "Father, where are we?" Mr. Murray looked at her soberly. "I don't know, Meg. I don't tesser very well. I must have overshot somehow. We're not on Camazotz. I don't know where we are. I think you're so cold because we went through the black thing, and I thought for a moment it was going to tear you away from me." "Is this a dark planet?" Slowly, her tongue was beginning to thaw. Her words were less blurred. "I don't think so," Mr. Murray said, "but I know so little about anything I can't be sure." "You shouldn't have tried to test her then." She had never spoken to her father in this way before. The words seemed hardly to be hers. Calvin looked at her, shaking his head. "It was the only thing to do. At least it got us off Camazotz." "Why did we go without Charles Wallace? Did we just leave him there?" The words that were not really hers came out cold and accusing. "We didn't just leave him," her father said. "Remember that the human brain is a very delicate organism. It can be easily damaged." "Sure, Meg." Calvin crouched over her, tense and worried. "If your father had tried to yank Charles away when he tussered us, and if it had kept grabbing hold of Charles, it might have been too much for him, and we would have lost him forever. We had to do something right then." "Why?" "It was taking us. You and I were slipping, and if your father had gone on trying to help us, he wouldn't have been able to hold out much longer either." "You told him to tesser," Meg charged Calvin. "There isn't any question to blame," Mr. Murray cut in. "Can you move yet?" All Meg's faults were uppermost in her now, and they were no longer helping her. "No, and you'd better take me back to Camazotz and Charles Wallace quickly. You're supposed to be able to help." Disappointment was as dark and corrosive in her as the black thing. The ugly words tumbled from her cold lips, even as she herself could not believe that it was to her father, her beloved, longed-for father, that she was talking to him in this way. If her tears had still not been frozen, they would have gushed from her eyes. And I'm going to go ahead and stop there. Remember, today you can write about anything that you find appropriate in the reading. And with that, I will say goodbye. Bye.